1917 is a wonderful yet simple film from writer-director Sam Mendes that is beautifully shot by cinematographer DP Roger Deakins. The film stars George MacKay, Dean Charles Chapman as Lance Corporals, Schofield, and Blake. Also stars Colin Firth as a general at the start of the film, and Benedict Cumberbatch as a colonel at the end of the film, with a couple other actors that are well known that pop up kind of in between. The film basically is shot in a way to where it seems to be one continuous shot. There's a lot of long takes, and in most cases you can't really tell where there's a stoppage in action or where they stopped and inserted a new cut or anything like that. It seems to be pretty much continuous the whole way through. And of course, Roger Deakins is amazing in terms of cinematographer, one of the best out there. And he does a very good job with this. A lot of natural light, a lot of beautiful landscapes, a lot of close-ups with some blurry focus and things like that. It really takes you in and gets you into the story, specifically because this is a story about the end of World War I during the trench warfare. And a lot of the opening shots in the film is the two guys walking through after being giving the orders from the general, the mission to take this notice across the country about 15 or so miles away. They end up weaving their way through the trenches before they reach the front lines and then start crawling over the front lines, where you can just see the horrors and ravages of war, of this style of warfare that's going on. There's bodies pretty much everywhere throughout the beginning all the way to the end, just kind of laying in various states of decay and pieces, some of them hanging on the wires, dead animals, and a lot of it shows kind of what warfare was like at the time, specifically how the Germans basically would just shoot all of the animals. There's one point where a guy comments on all of the dead cows and like, why would they do this? This is not right. It's pointless. Why waste the bullets? And another guy comments, well, they know that if they shoot them, you won't eat them. It's a very good film. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's one of those it's relatively simple because the whole plot or premise of the film is that these two lance corporals, they get a mission from the general to carry a dispatch saying that the attack that the colonel is going to carry out, Benedict Cumberbatch, is actually a trap that the Germans or the Jerrys had devised to lead them into kind of a pincer maneuver. So what happens is they get the dispatch and they end up basically having to haul ass, breakneck speed all the way across this war-torn country, avoid the Germans, and finally get to the other British soldiers that have moved past the original front line and into German territory. So they take off. They end up making their way through no man's land on the other side into the trenches of the Germans. Once they get there, they see how well built the German trenches were. They've got a lot of concrete. They've got bunkers and barracks and stuff kind of set up, while the British trenches are more or less just dug into the mud. There's, mud everywhere. They're all nasty, filthy. People just laying against, a little nook or cutout, while on the German side, they actually had a section cut out with barracks and a lot of beds and stuff and various little storehouses or things like that. So once they're there, they end up seeing that the Germans rigged the trenches on their side with explosives in an attempt to kind of bury or keep anybody from crossing through them. Schofield sees a rat and ends up triggering an explosion, but he is later saved by Blake, who pulls him out of the rubble and then leads a temporarily blinded Schofield through the remaining bit of the German trenches before they're able to emerge on the other side. They end up washing themselves off, kind of talk a little bit, and then they proceed on, and they come to a burned out farmhouse, French farmhouse, and they kind of reminisce or talk about the cherry trees. Blake mentions how, where he's from, they used to have an orchard, and that this time of year what it would be is it would look like snow because a lot of the flowers of these cherry trees and such are falling on the ground. They're beautiful white flowers. They see a dogfight between two British planes and a German plane. The German plane is shot down and lands into the farmhouse. The two guys, they then attempt to save the German pilot from burning up. And in return for their, noble cause of trying to help this guy, Blake ends up getting stabbed in the gut. It is a fatal wound, and there's a beautiful little moment of the two soldiers sitting there talking to each other. Blake asks Schofield if he's going to die, and he hesitates for a moment, and he's like, yes. And he's like, okay, stay with me. And then they sat there, and he waits until Blake ends up passing. This is a very sad moment. He takes Blake's rings, dog tag, along with the dispatch that Blake was carrying to take to the Colonel, Benedict Cumberbatch. Well, they then proceed on, or Schofield then starts to proceed on, and he's met by an additional group of British soldiers who give him a lift for a little bit of ways. And they're kind of jovial, talking about this and that. But there's a sober moment where Schofield tells him about his mission and how 1,600 people's lives depend on his mission, and him getting to this colonel's forces and stopping the next day's attack. The whole film takes place in the span of approximately 12 to 18 hours from the day that they're given the mission. The next morning is when the attack's supposed to happen, so that it's all very rushed and they're trying to get there. And the film is very tight. It's approximately an hour and 40 minutes long, and it is pretty much one continuous shot, with the only real passage of time being here or there where they're stopping or resting. And you can kind of see that it, like, he closes his eyes and he nods off, but then he wakes back up, and there's been an hour or two that's passed in there. But it's all beautifully done, and you don't really notice you don't really notice any issues with the one continuous shot kind of technique that they're using in this. This is one that is highly lauded today, and if done well, it looks really good and it flows really well. And in this case, it did do all of that. It's very well done in this film. Or once Schofield gets dropped off by these soldiers at a burnt out bridge, he then says, no, I have to go. I can't continue to go with you guys further down the road to find another bridge. So he starts to crawl across the bridge, and then he's ended up being shot at by a German sniper. He ends up making his way around, comes up the building that the sniper's in, shoots at the sniper, but ends up getting hit by a ricochet shot, which knocks him out for a little while. Again, this is kind of where you see the passage of time. It gets a little bit dark, and the camera kind of focuses on him, his breathing, and then boom, he wakes up, and you can tell it's been a few hours later. It's now progressed into night instead of the day it was before. So from there, he starts to move on. He's in a little bit of a daze because he's been hitting the side of the head, got some blood and stuff coming out. So he keeps moving, ends up seeing a couple other Germans running towards him, shooting at him, and he finds his way into a hiding place where there's a French woman, a little infant there. They end up having some conversation. He asks what the child's name is. She says she doesn't know. He looks at her and he asks where her parents are. She says she doesn't know. There's a bit of mutual respect for her because this woman is protecting this child at all costs. Schofield at that point then gives some of his supplies along with some milk that he was able to get at the farmhouse where Blake was killed, and kind of wishes her well and takes on after learning from her that all he has to do is follow the river, and then he'll get to where the other soldiers are and the colonel, which is Benedict Cumberbatch's character, where he needs to deliver the message to. So he gets into the river after being shot at by some Germans, and then that's another one of those little time-lapse pieces where he's holding onto a log, breathing with his head just above water. He falls asleep, goes into the water, wakes up a few hours later without ever breaking the shot, so it looks really nice. From there, he's able to progress on. Once he finds a tree across the river and a bunch of dead bodies, he starts to climb up the side of the river and go through the woods, and then he hears someone singing in English a song, and he kind of finds his way to them where he sees a bunch of soldiers sitting down. He sits down with the soldiers, and as soon as the guy's done singing, they start to get up, and he's still kind of in a daze there. And some people come up to him and ask him, what are you doing, mate? You're not one of ours. And he's like, no, I'm looking for, this battalion. They're like, well, that's us. You found us. And then that kind of revives him in essence a little bit. And he's like, okay, where's the colonel? He's like, oh, he's over here. We're the second wave. We're held in reserve. So at this point, he hears that the first wave has already gone, so the attack is commenced. So it gives him renewed energy. He takes off and runs through a newly dug trench, and it's a beautiful shot because the ground is very green. It doesn't seem to have had a lot of war in this area yet, or a lot of fighting. And the trench is dug out of this kind of white gravel, so it is a stark contrast. The trench is white gravel, and then the area and land above it is beautiful and green. He finds out from another officer, a lower officer, in this trench as he's moving along it, that the colonel's about 300 yards down it. At this point, he realizes he can't continue to make his way along the trench, so he takes the ultimate risk or ultimate sacrifice. He jumps out of the trench and then begins to run parallel along the trench toward where the colonel would be at the point where the next wave or the attack starts to commence. And the soldiers begin to pull over and go towards the Germans trying to fight. So he makes his way to where the colonel is. He gets held up. People don't want to let him in. He bursts through them, starts yelling at the colonel, "Dispatch from the general, dispatch. Listen, listen." And the colonel's like, "What do you want? Get out of here." He just kind of ignores him, and he's like, "No, sir. This is a direct order from the general. Just call off the attack." And then the guy's like, "We're not calling off the attack. We're ready to go. We're going to fight now because tomorrow they would tell us to attack." And then he tells him, he's like, "No, it's a trap. The Germans have been planning this for months. You're walking into a trap." And at that point, Cumberbatch's character relents, reads the letter, and it doesn't say what the letter says, but apparently it backs up everything that Schofield was trying to tell him in terms of it being a trap and that all of his forces would be lost if he carries on this attack. Cumberbatch then calls off the attack and then kind of has a nice word with Schofield before telling him to piss off. Go get him some help. Go have your wounds tended to piss off. So Schofield leaves. At this point, he's trying to locate Lieutenant Blake, or his Blake from the beginning, his older brother who was with the colonel. And he learns that Blake has actually already gone over and would have been with the first wave with his soldiers. So he starts working his way through the triage tents, sees a lot of the wounded soldiers kind of in daze, the medics working on them. And there's a beautiful little pan shot where the camera kind of drifts along one of the tents, and you can see the different wounds that the soldiers have. Some of them have pieces of their legs blown off. Some of them are missing limbs, just bleeding profusely, cut. They're all in ragged shape, showing, again, the horrors of war. But so as Schofield's walking, he then hears a voice, and it's Richard Madden is the older Blake brother, Lieutenant Blake. And what happens is he hears his voice and kind of looks over, and there is a bit of a resemblance between the two. So he says, "Are you Lieutenant Blake?" "Yes, I am." And he starts talking. He's like, "Oh, my brother's in that battalion." And there's a bit of a moment where he just goes quiet, and he's like, "Yes, sir, he came with me." He's like, "Oh, where is he? Is he here with you?" And then he kind of shakes his head, and he's like, "No, he didn't make it." And then it's understood, very almost wordless between them, that the brother has died on the mission to get to them to save their life. They have a beautiful moment where they kind of look at each other, and then Schofield reaches into his pocket and pulls out the younger Blake's rings and dog tag and gives it to the older Blake, who is holding back tears at this point, and it's very touching. And you can see that there is some love between the two soldiers, and he tells Blake that his younger brother saved his life, and then Blake, thanks him for being with his brother when he died, for not letting him be alone. And one of the things that Blake promised Schofield before he died, or asked Schofield to promise him before he died, was that he would in turn write his mother. So Schofield then asks the older Blake, he said, "Sarah, would it be okay if I wrote your mother? Your brother wanted me to." And he's like, "Okay, yeah." And then at this point, Schofield's mission is done. He looks over and sees this tree in the middle of this empty field with some kind of tall grass. And he kind of walks over in kind of a daze towards the tree, and then sits down against the tree, leans his back against it, and then takes out his personal belongings, where you see a photo of, I believe, his wife, possibly a child, or his wife and his mother, or just a girl he fancies in love, with a note that's written on the back of it. It says, "Come back home to us." And, that's a shot that mirrors the opening of the film, when both Blake and Schofield were leaning against the tree, resting, before being called in by the general to complete this mission. And then that's how the film ends. It just goes to black with a beautiful little line in reference to a Lance Corporal Mendes, which I'm assuming is some relation to Sam Mendes. And it says, "Thank you for telling the stories. This is for you." And then that's how the film ends. Again, this is a very beautiful film in terms of how it's shot. A lot of the action is there, and there's not really any issues with CGI or anything like that. You can tell they used a lot of practical effects, took the time to build the set pieces, the craters, the barbed wire, the various trenches and stuff, because they had the muddy trenches, they had the cement trenches on the German side, and then they had this white rock gravel trench in this new area where Colonel Cumberbatch was at this point. But like I said, it's a very beautiful film. I would highly recommend it. It's one of these films that is perfectly tailored for award season. I figured it'll win a bunch of awards. In fact, it just won a couple of the Golden Globes, and I could see it possibly being a contender for a large bulk of the Oscars in terms of the cinematography, direction, and probably Best Picture as well. And if you got some time, go check it out. It's still in theaters. It's a very good film, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. Certainly not if you do like war pictures, because it is kind of a war picture that's been turned a little bit on its head, and it's not a typical war film, but it's very good. Thank you.